Hello, everyone. So welcome to a conversation about gender lens investing with some very, 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 very cool people. Carmen, Vicky, Segal, excited to have this conversation. I believe you can put comments. I'm like not the tech person here, but I believe you can just put comments in or questions into the chat. Would be welcome for you to do that as we go through. But where we're going to focus today is really two angles, and this was really a conversation that got focused at the end of Gender Smarts conference back in London in November, and there was sort of this very clear, not a division, nothing violent or difficult, but just like two tracks. One set of conversations about, wow, we got to get more people in gender lens investing. What's the intro script? What's the 3 data points that you say that gets somebody who doesn't know anything about gender involved in the conversation? What do we do to get big investment firms, pension funds, others engaged in the conversation? Or what do we do to bring in new folks who have been working in the feminist movement or on gender equality and don't see themselves in this conversation? So that's the first part. But then there's a second part, which is it can't only be about new people. This is the same conversations we had in impact investing way back in the beginning of like, if you keep having conversations with new people, you don't get to deepen the dialogue. You're continuing to do the intro script, not getting to what's the more sophisticated or complex data models that might inform somebody who wanted to make a broader set of choices rather than the same 3 data points over and over again. So that's how we're going to structure this time. We're going to do one round of conversations that are about a focus on new entrants, and then another round at looking at deepening practices. But before we start, and maybe this is just because Vicky's on this call, and no matter what, Vicky starts with a place of hope. Maybe let's just start really quickly with one round of introductions and say, what gives you hope right now in the field of gender lens investing? Vicky, you want to start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. Thanks, Joy, for hosting. What gives me hope is that we're living mostly in a world where the people that are getting capital kind of all look the same. And in my world, I am the founder of Coralus. It's a community of women around the world who are contributing a small amount of capital each month into this shared pool. And we loan that money out at 0% interest to those who are mostly pushed to the margins, Black, Indigenous, women of color, non-binary folk, LGBTQ. And in the last 7 years with this unique model that we've set up, we've funded 170 world-changing, amazing folks out there who are like creating walking bikes and home compostable courier packaging made out of pollution and teaching 21st century skills through play and toys instead of textbooks, really just rethinking things coming from Indigenous worldviews. So pretty much every day, I am seeing people who are not only doing really cool ventures that make a difference in the world, but it's not just what they do, but it's how they do it. And they're redefining how business can be run and showing the range of leadership that's out there that we're missing from our structures that are set up the way they are.
Great. Carmen, quick introductions and where do you see hope?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I believe that we have a couple of reasons to be hopeful. And we talk about the need to boost intersectionality in the past, but it is very important to mention that in both the public and the private markets, more and more fund managers are employing multiple diversity lenses. So that is one of the things. Another thing that I detect is the gender lens investing is increasingly being integrated into mainstream investment practices. So large institutional investors and asset managers are incorporating gender analysis and considerations into their investment decision-making processes, recognizing the potential financial and social returns of gender-smart investing. And last but not least, something that I really see as an opportunity is the level of collaboration that exists within the ecosystem. This makes me really happy. Now more than ever, I think that networks, platforms are facilitating connections and knowledge exchange among stakeholders. So at Promoger, we see this really clearly. For the last 3 years, we have been organizing the GLI Forum LATAM, and year after year. This year, we are organizing the same in October in Medellin, in Colombia, and we hope that we will have there more than 1,000 people attending the same. So I see that there is a real interest in getting into this type of investment, and of course, I see that is a hope.
I would just like to add that over the last couple of years in particular, the sort of increased role that Promoher has been playing and the GLI Forum, just, I don't know, for me, it's one of the hopes in the field overall, just the leadership you all have been taking over. Like, you just sort of stepped in and said, nobody else is doing it, we're just going to go do it. Yay. Sigal, how about you? Where do you see hope in a bit about the Canadian Women's Foundation?
Sure. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here today with everyone online and co-panelists, Vicky and Carmen and Joy. I think for us at the Canadian Women's Foundation, we're seeing kind of hope in gender lens investing as a field, as a tool to advance gender equality, of course. But essentially, it's also a bit of an extension in some ways of gender lens philanthropy. As an organization that focuses a lot of our work on eliminating gender-based violence, we know that gender-based violence costs Canadians taxpayers billions of dollars every year. We spend collectively, $7 billion to deal with the aftermath of partner violence. That's $7 billion. That's a lot. That's 7 times more than the Social Finance Fund, right? To put it in perspective. And so for us, gender lens investing it's within this larger financial system, but we see many organizations that we've been working with who are interested in learning about the different tools, who are interested in mobilizing resources to address some of those gender equality pieces. And just to give you a bit of background, the Canadian Women's Foundation started about 30 years ago. Our CEO, Paulette Senior, could not attend today, and so I'm here on her behalf. And it was really started with a group of visionary women.
You're fabulous, though, and your leadership in Canada is so, I love the places that you're showing up with such an amazing voice. So I'm glad you're here.
Thank you, Joy.
Oh, that's great. Did you want to finish up anything more about Canadian Women's Foundation?
No, I think that's it. We'll keep it at that. We've been along for 30 years, and there's still lots of learning that has to happen. And there's so many networks and partnerships that are happening on the ground. And so we're just really taken aback by all the different ways that organizations are doing this work. And so this afternoon session with the Equality Fund is something I think we're really looking forward to as well, kind of delving even deeper to those broader investment strategies.
Yeah, there's so much activity happening in Canada in terms of gender lens investing between the Equality Fund and Coralys's long-term role and your sort of deep work within communities, moving capital. There's just been so much focus over the last bit. Always glad to show up in Canada virtually or in person. So a little bit so I'm Joy Anderson. I lead Criterion Institute and have for the last 21 years. And we were, as many of you might know, we were one of the people who really came together and founded the field of gender lens investing early on as a goal and the original point, because at some point I always think these lenses, how we handle different perspectives within a broader movement of moving capital for good is important to pay attention to. So before we dive into the sort of new entrance question, I do want to make sure that we sort of, I want to problematize a little bit sort of the tensions, the relationships between gender lens investing and social finance more broadly. In part because the reason Criterion early on focused on building the field of gender lens investing was because there wasn't a conversation about power happening in impact investing. 15, 16 years ago, there were lots of folks saying that they were going to innovate to create new futures, and all they needed to do was create an app, and voila, racism and sexism and misogyny and sort of colonialism was just going to fall away because of their brilliant innovations. And sitting in one of those conversations over and over and over again, I was like, it's not going to work that way, right? We're going to have the same people who had power last time defining what the new solutions are, but maybe with some new math. And so we got a lot of criticism early on in building the field of gender lens investing because the idea was, ooh, maybe you would distract. It's so hard to already do social finance, and now you're asking us to do gender. And then gender lens investing created the same problem. And so while we're going to work on being hopeful, I do want to name that one of the challenges that we've got right now is that gender lens investing and other fields like it brought one lens, but not, as Carmen named and as Sigal, as all of us talk about, not a broader intersectional lens. And that leads to things like two panels going on at one time, one about gender and one about indigenous capital and approaches to indigenous capital. And so I want to make sure, as we're talking about gender lens investing, everybody on this panel is committed to making sure that any lens that we're bringing is intersectional, right? It's also not useful to have an indigenous lens without a gender lens, right? Like, these need to be coming together, and there need to be distinct perspectives, because our feedback to the people at the time who said, ooh, can't you just do impact generally, is like, but gender's not actually coming out when we do impact. Things like gender-based violence, Sigal, we're not being talked about. And so you need to raise. So I always think it's a both and. Anyway, that was just a little bit of a rant from me. I'm sort of known for my rants. Anybody want to quickly build on that, and then we'll go into our new entrants conversation? We're good? We're all agreeing though, right? This is kind of a challenge. How do we make sure that we're balancing both the individual perspectives? And so maybe to you, Carmen, because the focus in Latin America, one, is super important, and just so much activity happening in Latin America. But what are you seeing from the perspective of new entrants, right? Our new capital allocators coming to the table? What does it look like to attract new entrants in Latin America right now?
Well, it is very important. While many investors and companies, teams are aware of the importance of gender equality and the benefits it can bring to their investment and businesses, few know how to achieve it. So
I know Carmen is speaking from sort of with times changing. She's actually speaking from an airport, so there might be some internet issues. Vicky, can I move it over to you for now, and hopefully somebody on the production side can let Carmen know and handle that a little bit. We'll move over to Vicky. What are you seeing in new entrants?
So, I mean, it's a lot of things. And I'm so sorry that she's like in the Panama airport and has to, anyway, I was thinking the Wi-Fi was holding up so well. Anyway, the world that we're in right now. So, we see, like, every year there are just like new waves of folks coming in who become aware of, what it looks like in the world, where capital is actually going. And more people aware of like the data that's out there, and then starting to, want to do something about it and get involved. And so for many years, I sort of witnessed this deep desire to get more capital coming to women and non-binary folk. And yet, to your earlier point, a lot of the things that are happening is people are just like, same system, same structure, just put women in front of it or non-binary in front of it. And as we all know, like, we're not going to transform anything unless we change the underlying structures. So, one of the things, Joy and I have talked about this quite a bit. We have like a podcast series around this, but people really needing to look at the underlying structures and to use their imagination. Start thinking differently about how we can allocate capital together instead of just doing like the standard kind of thing, because tons and tons of money is poured into this space. But as we just witnessed with a bit of retrenchment going on with what's going on with the economy, all of a sudden the money just like pulls back again. It's like these waves come in and it's like really exciting. And during COVID, we had increases and then pulls back again. So again, like, I kind of want to just underline the need for people to be really rethinking how we're allocating capital, thinking from the intersectional lens and also from power, which I know we're going to get to shortly. But really addressing power dynamics is critical to doing any of this. And honestly, not seeing a ton of really innovative things happening, which is the third session that's going on right now too, around innovation. All these things woven together would be kind of interesting.
Yeah. So I'm curious about your Suzanne Beagle and I have had a ongoing debate for years, to say, tied to the new entrants, Vicky, saying, do we need to make it really simple and really clear and the next easy step that people can take, or do we need to spark an imagination? Even just for new entrants, which of those, I sometimes think if we oversimplify for people who are showing up in Gender Lens Investing, then they're just underwhelmed. They're like, oh, this is about 5 women entrepreneurs. If that's all it is, I'm not that interested. And so the sparking imagination becomes really important, even in the introduction, to say what could be possible. How do you balance that sort of need to be clear, straightforward, simple?
Yeah, I mean, we start by centering relationships. And so the way that we've designed our approach is that we have investors, advisors, the technical assistants kind of folks, the entrepreneurs, all in the same community. And as we start to understand each other better, understand where we're each coming from, and like really have a similar lived experience because we're experiencing things, then that's when the imagination kind of kicks in, because you actually much better understand the problem set versus like, it's just a capital issue. It's not. There's all these other elements involved in it. And so for me, I mean, everything is yes and. Yes, simplify, and yes, get into deeper relationships so we can really understand this so that we can use our imagination. And over and over, like, I think we sort of see what's out there in the world, and therefore we think we have to fit into those things. And so if somebody says to you, I'm here to allocate capital differently, and you don't know what's really possible with them, and you don't really want to tell the truth because you think that you need to fit into the boxes, it's hard to get there. And we've just really learned over time and seen over time in our community that when you really get underneath it and you can actually understand each other, you're much more open to going, actually, this is really what I need. And the person's like, okay, great, I can help with that. What? But that's not a thing in the world, but it can be. Right. So we've seen a bunch of those examples, which is really exciting.
Yeah. So Sigal, as you're thinking about this from the perspective of, one of the journeys in Gender Lens Investing has been bridging to this amazing, sophisticated, robust world of women's philanthropy and people investing philanthropic capital to address gender inequalities and to advance good things. There have been some tensions between that world and the field of Gender Lens Investing. So what's happening now to invite whether it's philanthropists or women's rights groups or others into the conversation? What are you seeing work there?
Yeah, I think, thanks, Joy. And building off of some of Vicky's comments, it's, in the philanthropic sector, we recognize that philanthropy exists because of inequality, right? I think we all recognize that. But there has been some progress, right? With foundations making headway in trust-based philanthropy, for example, shifting investments to 100% mission alignment. That was, I think, discussed a little bit yesterday. And so we have experienced some philanthropic funding that could drive and be catalytic for gender lens investing, and also fold in new folks into to these conversations. For the past 3.5, 4 years, we've been working with 40 to up to 100 gender justice, kind of gender focused organizations that, for the most part, are relatively new. And as a national organization, we're working with partners across kind of Canada's ecosystem to deploy philanthropic funding, federal funding, essentially, to support organizations in getting access to capital and also boosting their participation and their interest in this field and kind of building this tent out a little bit more. We've definitely seen, for example, an appetite from charities and nonprofits who operate social enterprises. These are, for the most part, all led by women and gender diverse folks who are on the front lines. And, I have to say, over the last 2 years of the pandemic, charities and nonprofits are, for the most part, the ones who have held society together. We've also seen, a marked increase in those that don't see themselves in this field at all. Black racialized women, First Nations, Métis, Inuit women. And I think a part of this is that there's been, in our experience for the last kind of 3.5, 4 years, is that there's been this momentum, this groundswell of conversations happening amongst feminist movements and organizations that are advancing gender equality in different ways, that all have this interest in gender lens investing. They understand that the infrastructure is there. There's folks that want to kind of dismantle the infrastructure. There's folks that want to tweak it. And then there's folks that are tweaking it in different concerted ways. And so those conversations are all happening in tandem with organizations that represent such a huge diversity and range of organizations, from, a youth transition home, a sexual assault center, a shelter, all the way to, an entrepreneur, a founder, a fund manager. They're all having these conversations around how funding is flowing and what it means to communities in particular. I'm aware that Carmen is here, so maybe I'll stop there so that Carmen has a chance as well.
Well, and just coming back to you, I love Carmen. I'm going to pivot back to you. Hopefully you can share a little bit about what you're seeing in Latin America in terms of and I know you guys pay attention globally in terms of allocators, but I want to just quickly double click on your point here, Sigal, because I think there's one of the things that shocks the hell out of me about gender lens investing on a regular basis is the number of people who are doing gender lens investing, claiming an attempt at gender lens investing without actually very deep knowledge about how gender power dynamics, intersectional realities actually work in the world, and are looking for the oversimplified business case. And I know there are places where that's important, but we're not going to get where we need to go without the folks who actually understand lived experience in the conversation. And I think it took us too long to really get about that project. And you guys are playing such a critical role within that. I will say ProMohair was early on. Our first report on gender lens investing, 15 years ago, highlighted ProMohair as somebody who's doing a complex gender analysis in their work. And so you have always been doing this, but what are you seeing right now in terms of new entrants? And maybe you can take a bit and say, you can go from your new entrants into what are some of the places that you're deepening, especially if we have you connected.
Yeah, thank you, Joy, and sorry, cut off. But yes, what we have seen is that while many investors and companies, as I was sharing, are aware of the importance of gender equality, basically, in many cases, they don't know how to achieve it. So what we are trying to do is, as you stated, we have been working in this field for more than 30 years now. We know very well what has to be done. So what we have created is basically the Gender Knowledge Lab. This is an arm from ProMujer that allow us to give support to those organizations, those fund managers, those companies from the public and the private sector that want to go into gender lens investing and then they don't know how. But basically what we have seen in Latin America is that there is interest in gender lens investing. There is the fund managers, the investors, they are eager to know how to get into this space. And in many cases, they are doing and they are developing new financial instruments, but in many cases, they don't know how, and they need organizations such as ProMujer, such as Criterion, that can support them and can advise them on how to do it. So that is basically what we are trying to achieve. We are trying to offer workshops, trainings, awareness sessions in order for support other organizations to be implementing a gender lens. We are definitely trying to build the bridges between training not only investors and financial institutions, but also organizations with the aim of helping them become more diverse and gender smart. We also know that despite a strong commitment to implementing a gender mainstream strategy, companies also, they often lack the economic resources to address a gender gap and design new initiatives. That is why at ProMujer, in partnership with other allies, we are developing public and open sources, digital platforms such as the Gender Platform, the ILU Toolbox. So those platforms, those tools are open source. They are there for others to be used. And that is what we want to, how we to contribute and how we want to bring in more into this space.
Carmen, what drives, in your opinion, the interest in gender lens investing? Right. So if you're a capital allocator, what's making you interested? I'm just curious what you think is driving that.
Basically, what makes it's the impact you generate, because basically gender lens investing, what generates is gender equality, and it is proven the best results you can achieve if you implement a gender lens. So basically that is our main interest and the main interest of others to get into this space. And what we need is that I believe that we have to keep people within the genderless investing ecosystem committed to the mission itself. We have to think about several strategies in order to keep them committed. So I think that one is related to the engagement and the collaboration itself. I consider it is essential to foster a sense of belonging and active engagement within the genderless investing community. We must continually educate and raise awareness about the benefits and of course the opportunities of genderless investing. We also should celebrate more our success stories, because we have a lot of success stories. We must keep also using data and evidence to demonstrate the effectiveness and the impact of genderless investing. And I think that we have also to provide a strong leadership and role model within the genderless investing. We have to also give them the space. We need inspiring leaders who are committed to the mission to serve as catalysts and inspire others to stay engaged and dedicated to the cause.
I think the role that ProMujer and we had a session with a set of Canadian civil society organizations a month ago in Ottawa, just really looking at this need for, and I know just how much ProMujer is doing on this front with partners like Aquilo and others, is to build this translation function, right? This ability to say, here's how finance works. Here's how you do a risk analysis over time and how you look at different sectors. And Here's how you do finance. Here's how you pick companies. And this is how you then analyze gender, and that sort of tying those two together. I mean, obviously, this is also such a critical role that women's rights organizations and foundations and others can play. But how are we doing on building that translation function, Carmen? Where do we need to be deepening that? Just also recognizing that you have to go get a flight. So any hope or thoughts from you about what's coming out of some of that work? Because if people want to do it, they need to know how, and to know how, you need a different kind of expertise than we've got. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that, of course, we have tons of challenges, but of course, there is a need. Everything needs, we actually have to originate, we have to operate, but there are many organizations working and supporting and developing genderless investing, not only in Latin America, but worldwide. So I think that we have to be very well aware of also biases and the inequalities that are in place and that have been there for years. And we have to actually work together to ensure that evidence weighs more than biases. In that sense, from our position, it becomes essential to think that about diversity, as we were talking about intersectionality. So I think we have to be working much more together, coordinated, and of course, we have to be moving forward with Joy. I heard you more than once talking about how we should frame questions of gender as about power and power structures and not just about identity. So, and I cannot agree more. And of course, in that regard and that sense is where we have to be moving forward.
Well, we're going to move. Speaking of moving forward, we're going to enable you to fly forward. And so thank you so much for joining, but also really want to honor your time and thanks for joining this. And you did perfectly tee up a segue to Vicky to talk about power, right? Because at some point, how we think, thank you so much, Carmen. Always great to see you. As we think about, I mean, to our peril, right? When we think about gender as a static identity that's about just sort of some essentialist idea of what a woman is, not only do we get it wrong, but we don't see other possibilities, right? We don't bring that imagination, Vicky, to really rethink things. So, and I think one of the things that's not just understanding gender analysis and gender dynamics as about power, but what you've really unlocked within your community is people seeing their own power, really understanding that they can act. And as you were starting to get to in the previous conversation, they can act outside of the box. They don't have to just act within the constraints of how things work now. So what does it take to reinvent crap and not just keep doing the same stuff?
Yeah, well, it's you have to be a good salesperson to get people to try doing things differently, which tends to be one of my good skills here. So, so we came up with this model of like really rethinking it, and the way that selection and investment decisions are made is usually by a small group of people in a room who are like experts. And we kind of rethought that, and we have a way which is like completely community-based decision-making based on intuition. And I still remember in the first year, we're like, and everybody who contributes capital is then going to get to vote on where that capital goes. And in the beginning, people were like, I don't know how to select winning companies. I don't know. And I'm like, yeah, nobody does. Just so you know, like nobody does. We pretend that we do, but really, they make 10 bets and you hope one works is kind of the old model.
Right. That's the flip side of gender being about overperformance of confidence. I totally can pick all of the right deals every time.
Yeah. Like we're generally like really horrible at figuring out how to allocate capital efficiently, even though we pretend that we have all these like metrics around it, but really. And so this idea that everybody practices that. And so the initial stuff was like just getting people to like, you can do this, just trust your intuition. What do you want the economy to look like? Where do you want this capital to go? And as people did it, then they had fun doing it. And then they watched, like, I remember at the beginning, people would be like, oh my God, 3 of the 5 that I voted for were selected. I must know what I'm doing. And I'm like, it's actually just, it's the collective decision making. And then as people built up their confidence, then they started to invite folks to apply. And so they used their power out in the community to find those who weren't getting supported and invite them in to apply. And everybody in our approach gets personalized feedback from everyone who's voting. So we've been able to like create, take the abundance of all the resources in the community and direct that towards folks that have in the past been quite isolated and maybe don't have networks around that. And, like maybe just one story of what's possible when you do things like this is, so we have an Indigenous entrepreneur who was growing her company. And she started in her kitchen and 3 crock pots. Sacha is the company, Patrice Mousseau. And she is now in 1,200 stores across Canada, exporting to the US. The whole community has become customers and supported her in her growth. And a bunch of people came calling saying, you need more capital to grow and scale. And we're like, you're doing great. But part of the narrative out there is if you've raised money, you are more successful. And it's like insidious. It just gets into your bones. And so she took some investment capital, some angel investor with strong milestones of what they wanted her to do. And within a few months, realized this wasn't working for her. This isn't how she wants to run her company. The stress and the pressure of it to grow that quickly, to understand all these things that she just wasn't that interested in doing. And so she brought that back to the community as something like, what could we do about this? And one of the activators in our community helped her to unwind that venture investment, loaned her the money to pay the investors back so that she could 100% own her company and run it her way. And she'll pay that back over time in patient capital. And so that's not you don't see that out there. It's like unwinding venture investments. Who does that? Like nobody. Right. But when you get into deep relationship in these communities, that activator used her power because she had that capital because she does not want to cause harm to change that around. And so this is an evolution. It's organic over time. It's not like, oh, if you just do this and disrupt this power dynamic, X, Y, and Z are possible. Right. You don't know really what's possible until people really get in relationship and listen deeply to each other and support. But it's magnificent to watch people do the right thing with their capital and not just be here to extract as much as they can from the founder.
Yeah, it's a great segue, Sigal, to some of the things that become possible, and so the work that I've been seeing you all do over the last couple of years is how do we really shift the perspective from the capital allocator saying, here's how I fix these companies so they can be ready for my capital. One of the slogans at Criterion is let's fix the capital, not the company. Right. And we spend so much time. And I want to say really clearly, anybody who wants access to the current system of capital should be able to have it if they fit the needs of that capital. And we need to shift the orientation and say, not just how do we fix the communities and the companies so they can take our capital, but how do we work inside of the communities and inside of economies to figure out what kind of capital is really needed and shift that power dynamic. Sigal, what are you seeing as people are working in community, really imagining what's possible?
Yeah, I mean, Vicky said power dynamics. I think Carmen did, and Joy, you did as well. These conversations are centered around this idea and discussion about power dynamics. What we're seeing is, first of all, I think gender justice is at its heart a redistribution of power. It's a redistribution of opportunities and access. That's exactly what gender justice is. It's that. And so for the last 3.5 years working with organizations, some of the feminist movements and organizations, they hold such deep knowledge, right? Nuanced understanding. They are the bridge builders. They are having those conversations. They bring so much to the conversation. And so when we talk about bringing up power dynamics, for example, in an investment decision or in a funding process, it reaffirms the commitment. Just by the mere fact of discussing it, it reaffirms the commitment to gender equality each and every time. it's playing out in investment decisions or in funding. When folks are talking about increased representation, for example, in conversations with either those that are either receiving capital, with investment committees, advisory members who are delegating on a particular funding proposal, for example, all of that is having conversations about power dynamics. One of the members that we were speaking to in this kind of community of practice, this cohort that we have, dozens of organizations, feminist organizations, gender justice organizations, is that voices have to be heard, right? Obviously, and it's not just who's at the table. And so, at the minutiae and the granular level, what this means is that, looking at how long someone is speaking, how long other members are not speaking, who's taken up the most airtime, and bringing that back in every conversation, in every joint or point of when we're talking about either gender lens philanthropy or gender lens investing. Some of the other ways I think we're deepening, this in community is when, say, an investment proposal or a funding application, say in philanthropy, and we jump to the negative aspects of an Indigenous-led organization submission instead of the positives first, right? Or why we decline and dismiss applications or proposals or investment in a particular organization because of the burden of proof rationale, meaning why does the burden of proof come up? The burden of proof to come up with statistics, to come up with impact numbers, lie, for example, with Black founders and entrepreneurs, to prove a particular market intervention, to prove a particular solution when there's little disaggregated race data. And so all of these conversations at the minutiae granular level have an impact in the way that capital is designed and kind of who has access to it. In terms of your question, Joy, with the organizations that we've been seeing coming into this field, we know that for the most part, nonprofits and charities who are operating, in pretty interesting ventures, that a timeline of a couple of years is just not enough, that they need patient capital, designing capital in different ways, that they're taking that into their own kind of hands and figuring out what works for their organizations. We said that the Social Finance Fund has 16 years to kind of be deployed, both deploying capital and returning capital, but yet those that are equity seeking have, just a couple of limited times and resources to kind of get on that pathway. And so these conversations are happening amongst groups, within groups, and it's really heartening to see this conversation today and across the forum, this theme of reimagining, power, access, language, and all of these pieces. 5-10 years ago, we did not have these conversations with organizations we work with.
Yeah. I just think that so many of the things that you just named, call into question one of the things that I think we need to keep pushing on in gender lens investing, which is we can do investing the same way and point it at gender inequalities, or pointed at women, or pointed at Indigenous women, or pointed at Black women. Like that the idea that we can continue business as usual with all of the power dynamics that are in place within that is just, there are some ways where finance in its current form is super useful, but we have to be able to interrogate it because the mismatches are there. And I think one of the things that Criterion's really committed to in the Canadian government and MEDA and so many others who are sort of Canadian organizations have been walking alongside us with this, Corliss for sure, of like, how do we actually think about what does it look like to do gender lens investing, not just to name it as a goal? And we focus too much on what are the metrics that show that we're achieving a result, but not enough interrogation to say, but have you actually changed what you're doing? Or are we keeping the power dynamics embedded? So we've got 3 minutes left. Final thoughts. Vicki, you want to final reflections on the calls to action, whatever you want to say.
Yeah, I mean, I really do think that if we just look at the data that's in front of us, and what isn't working and where capital continues to go, this like opportunity to experiment and try things differently, to really interrogate, if you're a capital holder, to really interrogate, like, what do you really need with your capital? Like one of our activators said to me recently, she does philanthropy and investing, and she's very, very activist about where her capital goes, to those most sort of excluded from the systems that we're in. And she said, I started doing this 5 years ago. I put $15 million into the marketplace. I'm not getting it all back, but I still have the same wealth as I did 5 years ago. I'm good. And so she experiments all over the place, versus like her metric is, I'm like stable and fine. I don't need a 10x. I don't need an IRR of 22% every year, because she cares about the impact more, and she's maintaining her capital. So if more people kind of queried what they really need, instead of like just playing the game that is set out in front of us for the metrics that you like to talk about at dinner parties, I think it could be really exciting.
Sigal, how about you? Final thoughts?
I think final thoughts is, it always comes down to, for us in the conversations, who are we centering? Who are we serving? Are we co-opting language from social justice feminist movements? How do we fold in those new organizations and those existing organizations? Everywhere we know that, all things gender are being recognized in every way, in every place, in every form, in strategy and policy and frameworks. And I love that it's being reflected in finance and investment. And although I think we're moving slowly from the edges and into the core, it might be odd to say, but I like the slowness, because then that means there's intentionality and thoughtfulness reflected in that pace.
100%. And I just think I'm always struck, but I want to name as clearly as possible permission to not perform finance exactly the way it's always been performed before. And there are so many things that operate within finance to reestablish how processes work, what knowledge is valued, what expertise counts, who's wearing the right suit to be able to perform what action. And we can actually do something different. We made this up. We can make up something else. And that's the work that needs to happen, not just to only work within the system as it stands right now. So glad to be doing this work with both of you, and Carmen, and yay, let's just keep going forward.